Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly discussion. Thanks for joining me. And as always, thanks for the great feedback and the great comments and the questions that you bring up each week after the video is posted. Just a reminder, these videos are also on a new YouTube page that I created because I have heard great feedback from folks about how they don't really like Facebook or Facebook doesn't work well for them. So as soon as I can after the live stream is done on Facebook, I post it onto YouTube. And you can also search the videos there too. So if you're looking for a particular topic, I've actually used it because sometimes I forget. We're coming up on the 1 year mark of these videos, and I forget sometimes that I've talked about things in a video. I actually have to keep a list because I talk so much to so many people about various topics that I sometimes forget what I'm doing here on, on these live stream videos. Also, thanks this week. I got some great feedback about my monthly newspaper column, which was published at the end of September. It's usually the last week of the month in the Easter Advertiser, and thanks to the advertiser for giving me that outlet. It's great to be able to have a deadline once a month to write. I am working on a book project, but it's nice to be able to have something in the meantime, an outlet to write about. And the topic was this, as many of you know, and we've talked about it a couple times, one of the things I love to talk about are local legends and local stories that somehow got into the local history books, and unfortunately, they've been printed and talked about, but they're not necessarily true. And one of those stories was about that was repeated often, and it actually ended up in some local history publications, was that Irving Price, who was one of the founders of Fisher Price Toys, and the mayor at the time that this happened was in 1930. He and his wife Margaret Evans Price purchased the old Millard Fillmore house, the president's house, and moved it down Main Street. They are credited with saving it. Um, and moved it and the news accounts have it being moved in two parts down Main Street to its new location where the Prices owned property on Shear Avenue, where it is today, and since then has been converted into a museum where you can learn all about the 13th president, and it's owned and operated by the Aurora Historical Society. But Margaret Evans Price fell in love with this house. She's an illustrator of children's books and a writer. And in 1930, at the time that this house was moved, her plan, and ultimately it did occur. She converted it into her artist studio, right there on Shear Avenue. Well, one of the stories was that Irving Price, who was a very prominent businessman in town, so yes, he bought or he started, it was about the same month that they were launching Fisher Price Toys. He was also the mayor of the village at the time. The story is that he was on the roof of the Millard Fillmore house as it made its way down Main Street. So it was loaded on a truck and brought down Main Street, and he was on the roof pushing um, utility wires and tree limbs out of the way to make sure it didn't hit the house, that the house wasn't damaged, and likewise that the tree limbs and utility wires were not disturbed. Um, I'll let you read the article, but long story short, spoiler alert, there is no evidence that Irving Price was the one on the roof as the house made its way down Main Street, and it just was a local legend. And I talk a little bit in there about how I think that local legend got perpetuated. There is probably a good reason why. There were people on the roof, but it wasn't necessarily Irving Price. So thanks for that feedback on that. I enjoy hearing people's comments when the monthly newspaper column comes out. If you want the link to it, the Easter Advertiser, the link to the Advertiser website is previously on this page, and also I'll put it in the comments after I'm done with the live stream. But speaking of Millard Fillmore, a question came up again. This Millard Fillmore, for those who may not know, I know I get some folks listening from outside of East Aurora. Millard Fillmore, 13th President of the United States, uh, was not born in East Aurora. Sometimes you'll read that someplace. His family actually moved here, and then he followed them in 1820, and then he built his house in 1826, the house I was just talking about. Brought his wife here, and had his first child here. And then after 4 years in the house, he lived in East Aurora about 10 years, started his law career here, moved to Buffalo. Uh, And so we actually in East Aurora have one of the only houses that Millard Fillmore lived in, one of his houses that survive. It actually is probably the only house besides the White House of Millard Fillmore's. So his houses in Buffalo have been torn down, and his there's a replica of the cabin that he was born in the Finger Lakes region. But to actually have the physical house that, or most of it, it has been changed a little bit over the years. But to have an original house of Millard Fillmore's. Now, uh, Millard Fillmore has a reputation of being one of the least known presidents, and actually he ends up being at the bottom end when historians rank presidencies and rank presidents. These lists that come out are really difficult. I don't know who exactly is ranking presidents. It I don't like those lists, and a lot of historians don't like those lists because it's so easy to be like, that president was a bad president and that president was a good president. And as we've talked about before, even Abraham Lincoln had some unfavorable things about his presidency. So even your best presidents who are ranked at the top of the lists have some really unfavorable things that they did, as well as the ones that are at the bottom of the list end up having some really good things that they did. So it's really difficult. And it's also really difficult to judge a presidency by 2023 standards or modern standards. But in any event, Millard Fillmore has a reputation, and mostly because he signed what was known as the Fugitive Slave Law. And this was part of the Compromise of 1850, which was a series of bills that was meant to, as the name suggests, compromise between the North and the South. California was admitted as a free state, and slave trade was outlawed in the District of Columbia. And there's a whole bunch of other things you can Google about what the Compromise of 1850 was. But the Fugitive Slave Law is what it gets the most attention usually, because it was by our standards today and by humanitarian standards over a much bigger period of time, it is an awful law. It wasn't created. It was actually the Fugitive Slave Law had existed. Slavery was guaranteed in the Constitution, which is something that we forget. But this strengthened an existing fugitive slave law, and it was by a lot of standards, many standards, a bad law even at the time. It allowed enslaved folks to be returned back to the South. It actually required the North to return enslaved folks back to the South. So just because you made it to a free state didn't mean that you were free. And it actually rewarded marshals and judges for sending back enslaved people to the South. So folks did not get a fair trial. Actually, quite the opposite. The deck was stacked against the enslaved folks who were seeking freedom. So the Fugitive Slave Law, and Millard Fillmore actually saw his role. It was the law, and he saw that the Compromise of 1850 was the only way to prevent civil war, and many historians say that it did prevent. It actually pushed the Civil War off 10 years, at least a decade, and that the North was able to build its resources, particularly railroads, in the meantime, in order to be able to fight a civil war, and that many historians say that the North would not have won the Civil War if it were not for the delay. But that fugitive slave law really emboldened the abolitionists of the North, and as a result, Millard Fillmore gets this racist label. And it may be justified. I've had folks come into my office, and the reason I'm talking about this today is come in and we'll talk about Millard Fillmore being from East Aurora, and how it's too bad we didn't have Abraham Lincoln from East Aurora, or FDR, a good president from East Aurora. We are stuck with Millard Fillmore, and that's what someone said. And they said, why would we even want to? One person in particular said to me, we don't we shouldn't be talking about Millard Fillmore. He was a racist. We shouldn't be talking about him. We should ignore him. And so that got me to thinking, similar to what we talked about last week, is there's parts of history that make us uncomfortable. And the reason we should be studying Millard Fillmore and not ignoring him, even if you think he's the worst president in the world, and that could be debated. There's a lot of things, good things that he did. But even if he was the worst president, and the towns where James Buchanan came from and Herbert Hoover, who are routinely at the bottom of the lists, they still have sites. There are still presidential libraries where you can study these presidents. Similarly to Buffalo and East Aurora, you can go and study Millard Fillmore. And the reason it's so important, I think, is particularly to study Millard Fillmore is he he was the president of the United States. Whether you like it or not, you may think he was the worst president. That can be argued either way, and I'll leave that for you to figure out. I think he gets a bad rap in many situations, but even if you think he's the worst president in the world, we still need to study him, and we certainly can't ignore him. So couple reasons why we should not be ignoring Millard Fillmore and any president that you may deem at the bottom of the popularity list or the bad presidents list. They were still the president of the United States, so regardless of what you think of them, they still held the highest office in the land. So if you disagree with how they got there and what they did while they were president, it's still important for us to study the decisions they made, the circumstances under that they made their decisions in, and how they became president. If you don't think they should have been president, well, how did they become president? And that's something we really should be studying, particularly presidents who aren't as well known. So Abraham Lincoln, you can go to a lot of places to study Abraham Lincoln. You can go to a lot of places to study George Washington. And those are the presidents that you get signed in school to do your book reports on or your presidential reports. But how many people are studying Millard Fillmore? And it's sort of like this when people are encouraged to play an instrument in school. Everybody wants to play the violin or the drums, or there are popular instruments, but not a lot of people play the harp. And one of my music teachers had actually told me one time, there's like, well, you should play the harp because when it goes to, especially if you want a career in music, is because they're going to be looking for harpists. And they're going to be looking for the musicians who can play the more obscure instruments that aren't necessarily as popular in high school. So they encourage you to play the less popular instruments so that way you are the one they'll come to when they need a harpist. So similarly, people come to East Aurora and Buffalo to learn about Millard Fillmore because there's really nowhere else to go to study him. So first, we should be studying him because he was president of the United States, and also we are in a unique position where we can have the information and be the resource for folks. We are the only house in East Aurora here. We have the only house of Millard Fillmore, the only presidential site, essentially. Buffalo has the Presidential Center, the Buffalo in Erie County, the Buffalo History Museum, Erie County Historical Society. So these places that we have Millard Fillmore to study are fewer than would be your Abraham Lincolns and your George Washingtons. The presidency of Millard Fillmore, actually one of the family members of Millard Fillmore, their children had gotten upset. They live out of state. And they had gotten upset at one point. They had talked to me about how in their school, their teachers skipped right over Millard Fillmore, and they were upset, for obvious reasons, because they're related to Millard Fillmore. But I was upset because the presidency, the vice presidency, and the presidency of Millard Fillmore are a fascinating period of time in our American history with really extreme consequences. A lot of us study in school. They study the Civil War, early 1860s, 1860 to 1865. That's the period of time they study. But what we don't tend to study is the period that led up to that. How did we get to a Civil War? And that period of time is Millard Fillmore and other presidents, and the debate and how they tried to hold off the Civil War, whether or not it worked. Obviously didn't work. We ended up at a civil war. But your presidencies of Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, how we got to those presidents too are considered some of the worst on when you rank the lists. But we should be studying, if we, in fact, history, the reason to study history is to prevent from making the same mistakes over and over again, is what were the mistakes that led to the Civil War. And that period of time before the Civil War is really what we should be studying, and the decisions that were made. Millard Fillmore was sitting as vice president in the Senate. He was presiding in the Senate during the debate over slavery and over the Compromise of 1850. And he actually was the last president who was a member of the Whig Party. Um, so he had a lot of things, historical things about him that we should be studying. An entire political party fell apart during that period of time. Why did that political party fall apart? So it's a fascinating period of time. His presidency is often linked to the presidency of Donald Trump, relationship with Congress, relationship to his cabinet, uh, and Millard Fillmore's cabinet actually, there was a lot of upheaval during his presidency that's was often referenced during the Trump administration. So history was repeating itself in many ways. And I would read about Millard Fillmore in a contemporary news report and be fascinated by that because of the connections. One of the most important things I think we need to study Millard Fillmore for is he was never meant to be president of the United States. In fact, when he ran with Zachary Taylor in 1848, he was chosen because he was a former congressman who was relatively unknown from the North, did not own slaves, did not enslave people. Zachary Taylor did, a war hero. Zachary Taylor from the South, and they brought Millard Fillmore on to balance the ticket. Well, this is a mistake that the political parties have often made, and they tend to, frankly, still do it, is the vice presidency is an afterthought. And actually, Millard Fillmore's situation can teach us, even today, of how important the vice presidency is. And this has happened. I find it very interesting that we're already having, for months, we've had people running for president of the United States. There have been debates on the Republican side. The primary season is well underway, and we're more than a year to Election Day. The vice president is chosen by the presidential candidate, if not at the time of the convention in August, July and August, very shortly before it. And so the vice presidential candidate on each ticket is chosen, is finalized just a few months before Election Day. Now, it seems that if a position that important, that we should be vetting that person well in advance. Now, sometimes the presidential candidate will pick somebody who has run for president, so a lot of that vetting has happened, but that's not always the case. Sarah Palin, for instance, John McCain's choice for vice president, was not running. She was from, we had to get to know her. The voters had to get to know her fairly quickly. And that just seems like too quick for a position that could very well become president of the United States. And that's actually happened 9 times where a vice president has become president because of the death of the president of the United States or the resignation in Nixon Ford's situation. That statistically speaking, that's a lot. That's a lot. So, in the case, this happened with Millard Fillmore. He was just chosen to balance the ticket of Zachary Taylor. Well, he was not included in any discussion. Historians have researched, and during the president of Zachary Taylor, he wasn't even invited to cabinet meetings. He wasn't really even part of the administration. And Zachary Taylor dies unexpectedly in the summer of 1850, and all of a sudden, this unknown former congressman who served as vice president, who was just put there to balance the ticket, who really didn't even agree with everything that the president was Zachary Taylor's platform, is president of the United States. And I would argue was not prepared to be president of the United States. As much as we want, we are honored to have a president of the United States from our community. If you look at his presidency from an unbiased view, or as much as you can, he still wasn't prepared to be president of the United States. So this teaches us, again, learning from history, that the role of the vice president, I think, should be taken much more seriously. A lot late night talk show jokes about Dan Quayle not being able to spell potato, all these jokes about the vice president just being on the sidelines and not really prepared to be president of the United States. Millard Fillmore is a perfect example of the role of vice president, and sometimes the role of the vice president not being taken seriously enough by the president. Now, this is a tricky business because, right, the president, someone running for president, doesn't want a vice president. They want somebody in the position who's going to be prepared to be president. God forbid something happens to the president, but they don't want someone who has too strong of a personality and overshadows the president. So it's a really tricky situation, and actually the system is probably not the best for choosing the person second in line to the most powerful office in the United States, and perhaps in the Western world. So that's something we can learn from studying Millard Fillmore as well. The other thing, lastly, is when we talk about studying Millard Fillmore, we can't forget to study not just the president, but everything that's going on at that time period. We often focus on the presidency, but we forget that there was a Supreme Court making decisions at the time. There was a Congress making decisions at the time. So, the Fugitive Slave Law, Millard Fillmore signed it, and the Compromise of 1850 and everything that came with it. But there was a Congress voting for it as well. And so there's a much more complicated debate. And so when we study Millard Fillmore, we can't just study him as the president. We have to study the time period that was leading up to the Civil War and why these compromises didn't work. So we have to have a much broader picture. It's like today, if we were looking at the presidency of Joe Biden, you have to look at not just what is happening in the White House and with Joe Biden, but we have things happening on the foreign front with Ukraine and Israel, and then we don't have a Speaker of the House at the moment. So it's not just the president. There's some serious things that could be not happening because we don't have a House of Representatives that can actually do anything right now. So in 50 years and 100 years, when scholars are studying the presidency of Joe Biden, they have to look outside the White House too. There's no Speaker of the House right now, and there is a war in Israel and right now, and in Ukraine. So there's a lot of things that are much more complicated. So it's very easy for us to somebody to say, well, we shouldn't pay attention to Millard Fillmore because he was a racist and he was a bad president. Well, no, you may think that. But one of the lessons we can learn from Millard Fillmore as well is even if you don't agree with something, doesn't mean you shouldn't study it. There are many historians there are many Democratic historians that study the Republican Party, and there are many Republican historians who study the Democratic Party. You don't always, it's actually probably more fascinating to study something that you're not a part of. And so that makes it even more interesting. So would I probably have voted for Millard Fillmore? No, but it's very difficult for me in my 2023 view to judge an 1850 presidency. So who knows? We're much different today than we would have been in 1850. But I'm fascinated by the presidency of Millard Fillmore because there was so much happening in that period of time. And lots of upheaval at that time. and differences of opinion, and which led us to the Civil War. So when someone says, I get kind of unnerved when people say they want to just discount Millard Fillmore or all bad presidents. Why should we be studying them? Well, because if they truly were not, if they did do things that weren't productive, we don't want to elect someone who will do the same thing again, especially more than a century and a half later. We just want to learn from history and not make those same mistakes over and over again. Well, thanks for joining me. Went a little long today, but I hope that was okay. Again, keep your comments coming, and any comments you have about local history. It doesn't even have to be East Aurora history. And we'll see you next time. Again, I'm the town and village historian here in East Aurora, but these videos and a lot of my research are done separately, so anything I talk about here does not reflect my employer, which is the town of Aurora and the village of East Aurora. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.